And I think the inflation's absolutely real. If anything, I think the headline numbers that we see somewhat understate the actual inflation, in large part because of the shelter component. So it's kind of a wonky way for them to calculate it, and it somewhat understates and smooths out changes in house prices compared to how it used to be calculated. And so I think, the quote unquote real inflation is probably at least in the low double digits. So, kind of a few hundred basis points higher than it is now. But of course, everyone has their own, individual inflation basket because they all have their own, different things that they buy at a regular basis, the different weightings that they assign in their daily life. So there's no kind of one inflation metric, but I think if we were to have kind of a more consistent reading, we'd be at a slightly higher figure. That being said, we are seeing evidence of disinflation starting to materialize, meaning that inflation might be cresting and then kind of stabilizing at least for a period of time. So you could get disinflation doesn't mean deflation; it just means less inflation, like less rate of change. And so the way I would describe it is that the supply side remains largely unresolved. We basically have various supply side limitations, especially as it relates to energy and commodities. But there's the demand component. And by, tightening up fiscal policy to, kind of in an intermediate way, and by tightening up monetary policy, they're basically taking some of the demand off. But that essentially means a recession. Another thing that I think people have to keep in mind is that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is still being drawn down, and that's still expected to continue for a little while longer, and so that's putting somewhat downward pressure on oil prices. So I think right at the current time, I think we hit kind of a fever pitch in terms of inflation, and now that it's rolling over somewhat. But I think that the problem is that it's kind of like holding a beach ball underwater. It's ready to return as soon as they kind of let go of some of those levers. And of course, there's other variables too. We have to see what happens out of China, right? Because China is a huge demand source for commodities and energy, and they're showing weak economic data as well. Obviously, the one spot where there's still huge inflation risk more than anywhere else is probably Europe, because they have the most severe supply side limitation. But I think that's kind of where the data is pointing at the current time. So I think that there's reasonable criticism that they're, kind of drawing it down for political reasons, that it's not an actual crisis, and that they're basically suppressing prices leading up to the election. I think that's a reasonable criticism. Whereas, for example, what's happening in Europe is more of an actual crisis. In the United States, we have high energy prices. In Europe, they have crisis level energy prices. The other part, though, about selling it overseas, that one, I think is more straightforward in the sense that, my understanding of the way that reserve works is they have, when they choose to draw it down, they have to sell to the highest bidder. And it just so happens that in some of these bids, China was the highest bidder. Now, on one hand, commodities in general, except for natural gas, because it's so the costs are so much in transportation, but certainly in oil, it's a relatively fungible market for the most part. And so if you have demand anywhere in the world, that's going to trickle through global prices. And so I still think that them selling to forwarders actually does put some downward pressure on domestic prices as well, because it's a fungible market. Now, that still could be a separate matter from whether it's a good idea to draw down the reserve or not. I think it's probably, not. But I wouldn't put them as like the motive of, say, trying to say just push down foreign prices. I also think if you look at polls, for example, if you ask people what is the biggest concern facing them, inflation will be, at the top, and then like high gasoline prices, which is another way of saying inflation, is like, number 2 or 3, and then high rent prices, which is another way of saying inflation, is also like, 2 or 3. And so I think they have a legitimate interest in pushing down energy prices in the intermediate term, because they generally want that to be reflected in how the vote goes. Because if they if they go into the election with like $7 oil across the country, I think that's going to be a lot harder for them than if they go into the election with, $3.50 oil, a gasoline, for example. So that's kind of how I'm analyzing that situation. So I think they can take action around the margins. And I think we're seeing that show up in the housing market, for example, how that impacts, mortgage rates and things like that. This partially from private market forces and then partially from those kind of more central forces. And I think, basically they have a number of tools that kind of rein in demand. And in their view, they want to try to use them moderately. But of course, if you look at the historical track record, soft landings are rather rare. in U.S. Economic history, right? Usually they tighten into a recession because they during the loosening phase they basically encourage debt accumulation, and then they tighten the screws on anyone that actually took out debt in that environment. And so I think we're seeing that play out now. We're seeing a cooling off in the housing market. We're seeing some softness in the labor force around the margins, at least. So especially when you look at initial jobless claims each week, labor force participation, job openings. Ever since March 2022, we've seen kind of a softening in there.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I have bad news for you. If you're not rich by now, you're screwed. And if you're in debt, you're even double screwed. How so, you might wonder? Well, the sad truth is that you're working your whole life to make someone else rich. The mega corporations, the banks, the politicians, everyone is getting richer. They get your money. And what is even worse, they get your time, they get your life. You are not even in a rat race, you're in a financial prison. But what could a solution for you look like? Honestly, I don't know, but I know what a solution for me would look like. It's very simple. I use whatever money I have and I multiply it with 1,000. This could make my life much easier and probably yours as well. If you have $1,000 available and multiply this with 1,000, I believe that this could solve some financial issue for the one or the other. Of course, if you're ugly, you would have to multiply it with much more than 1,000. My name is Markus Dahn, and this is what I decided to do. I decided to 1000x my money. This is not a joke. I know what you may be thinking. What is this guy talking about? How should this work? This is not possible. Well, I made a detailed video where I laid out my plan. And some clever folks might even want to look at this plan and copy it and do exactly what I do. This is just a little hint on the side. You have two options. You leave, you forget what you have seen. You do whatever you're doing and you hope that somehow you get some other results. Good luck with that. Or you click the link below the video. You enter your email address because I'm not showing this to everybody. You at least watch my video on how I plan to 1000x my money. The choice is yours. Make the right choice. Join me. See what a different future you could have. See at least how I plan to do the 1000x. So click on the link below, enter your email address, and I see you on the other side. Your Markus Dahn.